Welcome to this online reading in the David Shove Memorial Midstream Reading Series. My name is Don Brunnquell, and I'm one of the coordinators of the series, originated by our friend, the late David Shove. We're very happy you can join us tonight. The readings were organized by David until he passed away about 2 years ago, and were hosted by John Kolstad in his lovely, funky second floor space. We hope that we'll be back there before too long. The Zoom chat function will be open during the reading, although the readers will not be following the chat during their reading. So tonight our authors are Jim Cihlar, Rachel Frazin, Lisa Higgs, and Michael Kiso-Moore. I will introduce each of them before they read. Just a little bit about how this will work. After my general introduction, I will read a brief poem, as David did, to open each reading and warm up the audience. That was especially appreciated in those cold winter months when people ventured out of their warm nests to hear poetry. We have the opposite issue today. It's so beautiful outside. Why would anybody be indoors looking at Zoom? But here we are. I'll then introduce the first reader, who will read for 10 to 15 minutes, and during each poet's reading, all microphones except that of the reader will be muted. After each reader, we invite you to give visual applause in whatever creative way you can bring. I will then introduce the next reader. We'll all be muted until there is, again, a brief period for visual applause, and so on. At the end of the reading, all microphones will be open for 10 to 15 minutes, which is always an interesting experiment in chaos theory. So this is all assuming that this all works according to plan, and spontaneous changes by the Zoom master are, of course, possible. And I should mention that tonight's reading will be available on the Midstream website. Just Google it is the easiest way to get there, Midstream Poetry Series. And I'll mention that it was our tradition to gather before the reading at Milkweed Coffee House at 3822 Lake Street, and gather afterwards at Merlin's Rest at 3601 East Lake Street. And we encourage you to patronize these great establishments as possible in these complex times. So, to start today's reading, as an invitation for you to settle in, I'm going to read my poem called Invocation for a Reading. Every reading is a wedding. So many paths, so many spirits, so many dreams. You are invited. Come as you are. No need for fancy clothes. The cape, the shoes, the fascinator are already present, waiting for your imagination to be worn like the marriage path is worn every day and night. Listen, I hear us now, all of us dreaming. Yes, that's the sound of dreams walking towards us, waiting for these few moments when our spirits are joined. Speak your vows as if they were the truth. Break the glass, kiss the beloved, hold hands, walk down the aisle side by side. We will never all be together again. Now, on to this evening's readers. First is Jim Cihlar, who is the author of The Shadow Graph, published in 2020 by the University of New Mexico Press. His previous books include Rancho Nostalgia and Undoing. His poetry chapbooks are A Conversation with My Imaginary Daughter, What My Family Used, and Metaphysical Bailout. His writing has appeared in the American Poetry Review, the Threepenny Review, Lambda Literary Review, Prairie Schooner, and Nimrod. He earned a BA in English at the University of Iowa, where he studied in the Writer's Workshop, and his MA and PhD in English at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He's received 3 Minnesota State Art Board's fellowships in poetry and a Glenna Luche Award from Prairie Schooner. Please join me in welcoming Jim Cihlar.
Great. Thank you, Don and Paul and my fellow readers. And thanks all for coming out tonight, so to speak. You all can hear me okay, right? Okay, good. So yes, I will be reading some poems from this book, The Shadowgraph, as Dawn mentioned, which is a book of poems somewhat loosely themed around film, classic Hollywood cinema, and in particular, the second half of this book at least focuses on movies that starred the actress Barbara Stanwyck, who is sort of an obsession of mine. Before I dive into that, though, I'm going to read a poem that was on Poetry Daily last fall, and it's called The Way Words Echo in Our Heads. I wish we could hear them just once instead of over and over. One day, tired, I sat down on the couch just to listen to the ringing in my ears. My eyes are so deep set in my head, it makes it hard to see. Past the memory of lost glamour, being born too late, living in the shadow of a beautiful downtown turned into a ghost town, a hollowed hulk, and how that itself now turns into a memory of treasures. How when something taken for granted is suddenly over, the pause when you take stock and realize you'll never have as much, that change is always a lessening. The wall effect. You can't see what's next, even though it's supposedly obvious. I don't know what to say about that. I mean, I'm just barely here. So that was The Way Words Echo in Our Heads. And now, thanks, reading from The Shadowgraph. So I am reading poems that come from the second half and that are kind of in conversation, if you will, with Barbara Stanwyck films. So, and I'm kind of reading from the back forward. So this poem's called Witness to Murder, and it's also the name of one of her films that also starred George Saunders. It's sort of a Vertigo-esque film noir that's actually very interesting to look at today because it deals pretty bluntly with kind of some issues of gender and politics. So here we go. Witness to Murder. How are you supposed to know what they tell you without words? Once you translate one sign, how many more require decoding? No one believes you except the murderer himself. Listen without telling. Their memory is just as good as yours. After you witness him strangle a girl, George Saunders' insinuating tone places you in a mental hospital for the old and lonely. Everyone hates you there, they say. You come out rehabilitated, conditioned, until you let the mask drop and name what you are seeing. Call the murderer a murderer. Once we face the fact, what else do we have to admit? Once you find out you were right, what does that mean for every other instance of doubt? So if you've seen the film, or you might have gathered from the poem, Barbara Stanwyck plays a woman looking across the street into the window of the apartment of George Saunders, who is a reconditioned Nazi. and witnesses him commit, and he's also like a scholar, and he's been demobbed, you know, by the US military. So she sees him committing a murder. She reports it, and yet he's able to use gender as a way to say, well, she's this hysterical woman, and she gets locked up. But then that's not the end of the movie, but that's the basic premise of it. So, okay, moving on now. Next one is kind of from the same period. It's called No Man of Her Own. I have to admit, just the plots of the movies themselves kind of intrigue me because, and you might be familiar with this one. Again, No Man of Her Own is the title of the poem and of the movie. In it, she is a pregnant woman jilted by her no-good boyfriend on a train. The train gets in a big crash. On the train, she meets a woman who's going to visit her for the first time, her boyfriend's parents, and she's with her boyfriend. And the train wreck happens. They both die. And here, Barbara Stanwyck, with really no place to go or anything to do, takes the place of the woman who died and goes and visits the family, and actually then falls in love with the brother. So anyway, I don't mean to make fun of them because they're actually watch these movies. They're amazing, and they're also sort of historical documents as well. So no Man of Her Own. No is both none and all, the snake eating its tail. No man may be every man, or at least any man. Let's say the brother of the dead. Dumped by her cheating boyfriend, a pregnant woman takes a train to nowhere, which again is everywhere or anywhere. Looping in a circle or sphere into infinity. After a crash, we all become someone else anyway, so why not make the most of it? The world is the cast. She takes the place of a dead lady and goes home to her family. Is it wrong to fall in love with the brother? Too old to play this part, she looks for something lost. Even if she found it now, what we know and can remember is the feeling of being lost, of missing something, so that even after it's found, we keep looking. And this next poem is in conversation with one of Stanwyck's more famous films, which is Stella Dallas. So, Stella Dallas. Anne Shirley, who plays the daughter, grew up on the RKO lot, graduated from the Studio High School. For her 18th birthday, Goldwyn gave her a car. Hollywood was her every day. She'd put in her shift on the soundstage, then go home and cry because the director would not direct her. In Stella Dallas, the daughter marries money. Even though we know real life is always about the young and sexy, this movie is all about the mother. Bird-breasted and built for speed, Stanwyck wore 3 sets of stockings in order to have thick ankles. She said it was a matter of upholstery. She stuffed cotton in her cheeks for jowls. My poor old mom took it on the chin. My dad dropped her when his first love became available again. My sister remembers more than I do how our stepmother walked the hall on Sunday mornings saying, "Your mother is a whore," saying, "You will all wind up in hell." My sister says she's buried now in my father's hometown, that hag. Anne Shirley played the younger Stanwyck in So Big. If the daughter is the mother, is she premonition or nostalgia? My sister's middle name is Anne, in honor of our mother's mother. Really, I have just a handful of memories. the burgers at the cafe in Underwood where my father took us. My sister remembers the name of the place. I just remember the taste of too much pepper. Or walking my father's farm after school, finding cacti growing in a stream bed, chasing the planter behind my father's tractor. My sister says it's time to let that handful go, because it all comes down to dirt. They say Stanwick came from nothing, even though her family dates back to 1740. Her father left them to work on the Panama Canal after her mother died. Her sister raised her. Stanwick's husband, Robert Taylor, was born in a small town in Nebraska, just like my father. During the making of all those movies we love her for, Stanwick was suing the studios to get paid, angry and grief-stricken at the loss of her sister. In both the silent and the sound versions of Stella Dallas, at the end the camera closes up on the mother crying at the fence as the story struggles to make sense. That ending refers to that there were at least two versions of the film. Of course, Stanwick starred in the talkie version, but there was, I believe, a silent version prior to that. So Stella Dallas. And I'll finish with actually the first poem in the book, pardon me, which is called Marwick. And the title comes from the name of the horse ranch that Barbara Stanwyck found, kind of bought and built, I think in the valley, in, back in the day when it was not quite settled yet, outside Hollywood. It's called Marwick because it's a mashup of her agent Zeppo Marx's name and, of course, her name. So Marwick. And when I read about that, it kind of spoke to me a little bit about the notion of utopia and just sort of time out of place out of time in a way. So actually the original title of my manuscript was Marwick. And so the image of that kind of recurs throughout the poems. So here we go, Marwick. It begins with a quote from Barbara Stanwyck, which is, "I wear myself out, keeping myself calm. I can love them all now, because what does it matter? A chemical in the brain makes time spin faster. The rolling wheel of aftermath loses heat as it tumbles down the dell. A Christmas card my mother bought is my memory palace. All the elves asleep in a row of beds on a travertine balcony above the hearth. Let's pin it down to blueprints. How much closer can we get to living? Stanwyck built a castle in the Southern California desert and made it look like Camelot. She rode the train from Hollywood to 70 years ago. When FDR pressed a button in the White House, confetti rained down on Omaha. I bet God will understand the smallness of my wants. In the middle of summer, I miss summer. Marwick will be my heaven. I've peopled it already with ghosts of the living." Thank you very much.
Let's all visually thank Jim Cihlar. And thank you for evoking all of those wonderful films and scenes. It's great. Thank you. Our next reader is Rachel Frazin. And she and her late husband, the poet Mike Finley, raised a son and a daughter in St. Paul's Miriam Park. Rachel is a nurse practitioner in family practice who has worked extensively with diverse, underserved populations in the Twin Cities, in addition to her work among Native people living in the Alaskan bush. Her 24-year-old daughter's overdose on a mix of prescription drugs in 2009 precipitated an existential crisis that led Rachel to research and write a memoir with the conviction that explaining why Danielle had taken her life would not only fuel her own transformative grief, but could also help others who have survived a parallel loss. With a journalistic eye honed by her background in anthropology, she embarked on a 10-year global pilgrimage of grief, which examines the biological and cultural contributors to a 21st century American plague of self-destruction from suicide, overdose, and alcohol toxicity. Please join me in welcoming Rachel Frazin.
Thank you, Don, for that introduction. I'm reading from my completed memoir titled A Life Abandoned. A nurse deconstructs her daughter's overdose in an American era of despair. The excerpt I am reading takes place in a remote Alaskan Arctic village in November 2009, 2 months after my daughter's fatal polysubstance overdose. I am working there to provide primary care and to manage emergencies when they arise. The excerpt is taken from a subchapter titled Consciousness and begins with a dream Danielle had posted on Twin Cities Punk 3 years before her death in 2006. I had another zombie dream. What does it mean that I always end up giving up and offering myself to them or killing myself? A few posts later, she continues, we're afraid of zombies, of course. In the movies, everyone tries to survive as long as possible. Not me, no sir. That's the part I wonder at. I returned to the village where I had worked the previous year in the aftermath of a 15-year-old man's suicide by gunshot. At that time, I imagined the survivors of the suicide resided in an ill-fated land beyond a chasm that would protect me and mine. Now I returned within the crucible of my own grief in the hope that living and working in the bush would provide me solace, in part because personal tragedy is so commonplace in the remote settlements. No man, woman, nor child, the age of reason, does not know that sometimes people murder themselves. Several days after my arrival, I called my husband, Mike, who was at home with our son in St. Paul. When Mike answered, my vocal cords tightened as I murmured, yeah, it's me. I dreaded the 2-second delay in voice transmission that always tripped us up. During our Alaskan calls, Mike had a harder time than usual getting a word in edgewise. I began, I'm feeling fragile. I teared up while watching a daughter help her frail mother onto the exam table today. I couldn't staunch the self-pity, just knowing that Danielle won't be there to compensate when my body and mind begin running on low octane. Mike started to respond, but I preempted him. She sure wasn't thinking about us when she tossed back those pills. A long pause ensued as we waited, uncertain whose turn it was. I slowed my cadence to a trudge. We could never make anything better for her. What a terrible bind to feel so responsible, yet so powerless. Mike relived his regrets. I could feel her going down after the second failed fistula surgery, but I couldn't cross the bridge to keep her from spinning away. I sympathized. I tried to be her friend, but I feel like I failed her as a parent. You know that I gave the children over to God 4 years ago. I was feeling neurotic, always on the hot seat to come up with a winning strategy. It all ended so catastrophically for my faith and optimism. I am angry every day at God, Danielle, people from the church, friends. I spent 5 years praying to God to save my daughter, and it didn't work. She's dead and gone. That case is closed. He paused to recover from his loathsome words. Resuming with more assurance, he declared, now I'm redefining God as a force who is suffering with us instead of saving us. Relief washed over me. I hated that Mike had paid so dearly for a belief in God that is contingent on divine acts of beneficence. I hadn't condoned the theological bargain he'd cut to stay afloat after Danielle's first overdose in 2004 for fear of what came to be. His bitterness toward God and members of the church, if his prayers went unanswered. He'd known that her first OD might not be her last. For my part, growing up in the shadow of the Holocaust had disabused me of any notion that God plays favorites. Mike continued his lamentation. Our friends mean well, but nothing they say helps. No one can understand what we're going through. Some days I think I can never be friends with old friends again. Mike speculated. If we pushed her harder to get psychiatric help, maybe it would have changed the outcome. I defended our efforts using behavioral psychology. We were like rats pushing a bar for treats. She rewarded us richly until she left home. After the 2004 OD, we showered her with suggestions, study English literature, but she didn't pursue the university programs we researched. Volunteer in a developing country, but she rejected helping the needy. Attend Emotions Anonymous meetings. When she hadn't acted on our suggestions, we stopped pushing the bar, a classic case of learned helplessness. She'd made it clear she'd find her own way. Mike generously offered. It was your optimism over the years that kept her going. You were the one who advised her against applying for Social Security disability benefits when she floated the idea in 2004. You showed her confidence. You showed confidence that she could make it on her own, which was exactly what she wanted and needed to hear. Dumbing down disability had been a cinch. At 21, Danielle was too young to take on the label of disabled. We'd bide our time. From my experience with patients, I'd seen that disability benefits are best reserved for young people with globally diminished function and few financial resources. State support could have even perpetuated her dependence on the system, attenuating her belief in her own competence. As Mike and I struggled to make sense of what happened to Danielle, we'd been influenced by 20th century Freudianism that insisted that personalities established by age 5 in the context of early life experiences within family. Until the day she died, I'd been convinced that the adult Danielle had the same potential as a child we so carefully tended. I hadn't believed her when she would say, "I can't do that, Mom," in response to my suggestions that would advance her progress toward full-fledged adulthood. In the months following that conversation with Mike, I sought out 21st century neuroscientific research that altered my interpretation of what had happened to Danielle. Her brain had changed, termed neuroplasticity, in response to life experiences, especially harmful events, including a sexual assault at 16. Her prefrontal lobes, the seat of the thinking mind and executive function, had been wired negatively from the beginning, generating a foundational pessimism in which perceived failures and traumatic events furrowed her brain's fatalistic pathways ever deeper, causing her to lose faith in herself and hope for her future. On the Minnesota State High School writing sample, she'd scored a perfect 6 on an essay on the glories of flying, which reflected the high value she placed on freedom. But by the time she was 20, she'd become imprisoned by her labile moods and restrictive phobias, including taxi drivers, malls, and restaurant seats facing away from the door. Too late, I got it. Her awareness of her evolving limitations in response to harmful experiences had caused her to jam the brakes on our expectations so as to avoid the intolerable anxiety our hope engendered. Yet even without all that knowledge, I had intuited in this early conversation with Mike that evening in the village that we were not to blame. I knew that Mike had a fatalistic turn of mind and it would require convincing. We acted out of our best intentions for Danielle. Friends and strangers have honored our courage in speaking out about her overdose. Her death has already benefited others. Our loss has reminded everyone of the tenuous hold they have on the ones they love. Do we have any other choice than to grow, to put the whole parental conundrum in the soul bank? Mike reacted vehemently. Growth? Isn't it dishonest to pretend that we've accepted and transcended this? Isn't it premature? We have to begin sometime. Why not now? You've already initiated the healing with your reminders that she might have been an adolescent suicide, but for the negotiations and compromises we'd made, that she was a wild child with her volatile negativity and intense desire to live authentically. Sounding defeated, he asked rhetorically, "What's the use of all this consciousness?" I was too depleted to continue sparring. Quickly, I said goodbye. Gotta go, gotta do a home visit, I love you. At 8 p.m., Marion, a homebound elder, phoned to ask whether I was still planning to visit her. Too drained to invent an excuse, I told her, my daughter recently overdosed, which we believe was a suicide. I've been delayed by a phone conversation with my husband. Marion firmly assured me the visit could wait another day. When I asked her why she had requested the visit, she mentioned problems breathing. I told her I'd be right over. I reviewed her health summary and packed some steroids and an antibiotic, figuring that her chronic obstructive lung disease was the likely culprit. I stepped out into the chill night. The Big Dipper's pointer stars teased my eyes toward the North Star overhead. Inside the ambulance, I distractedly searched my pockets for keys, forgetting that they're left in the ignition, just begging to be joyridden. When I turned over the engine, the public radio station popped on. Because it was Pledge Week, the locals' favorite musical genre was broadcast live from Friends Church. With a steady thrum-thrum of a guitar behind them, wavering voices extolled their love of Jesus. Because street names are superfluous in the village, I made a few wrong turns before finding the, quote, blue house near the tank, per Marion's directions. I entered the mud porch where pungent tobacco smoke invaded my nasal passages. Through the crack in the door to the house proper, I called out to Marion, asking her to put out her cigarette. Not an ideal way to strike up a relationship. A diminutive elderly woman beckoned to me from the living room, arms raised high in a V. She embraced me, exclaiming, "I'm Bee, Marion's friend and helper. She told me about your daughter. I lost 3 of my 15 to it." I peered down into Bee's twinkling eyes and set in her craggy face. The TV and evangelist's audible cadences prepped me for the answer to my next question. How did you manage to deal with the loss of 3 sons? Jesus, and he will help you too. Marion lay half reclining in bed in a cluttered room the size of a walk-in closet. I could see by her long blonde gray hair, hazel eyes, and high cheekbones that Marion had been an Inupiaq beauty. I felt her forehead, no fever. Her breath was shallow and quiet at 40 respirations a minute. "Show me your Nuvuk," I said. She spit into an empty juice bottle, the 4th hawker I'd seen that day. Her frothy white sputum suggested chronic lung disease with perhaps a touch of heart failure. Without an x-ray machine, I had to rely on signs and symptoms. The Inupiaq aren't self-conscious about secretions, perhaps because noses run so frequently in the cold. And traditionally, the Arctic has been paperless. Mothers once sucked boogers out of their babies' noses. And given the price of Kleenex here, some still do. After auscultating Marion's lungs and heart, I asked her about her children. She'd birthed 16. Several had died during infancy and childhood from infectious diseases. When I asked how many were living, she named each one, touching her right index finger onto the finger pads of her left hand for a tally of 6. Because at one time elders had little use for numbers, they sometimes don't count in their heads. Marion was battling 10 and 16 to my 1 and 2. I tried to crunch the suffering variance between the 2 ratios. So much depends on the mother. For me, having 6 remaining children would have been better than 1. But I was in no position to grasp the soul-sucking loss of 10. Marion's inhaler held a breakfast confused her, so I reviewed each one. She complained that the health aides never deliver her medicines, and I gently explained that that's not their job. That's what your grandsons need to do. "They don't have transportation to clinic," she said. Like families in the lower 48, young people without purpose sometimes can't find motivation to help out at home. I didn't say this to her, I said it in the text. Now Marion questioned me about Danielle. I was no longer just the Nulag Mu, that is white, nurse treating her lung disease. The kindness in her eyes facilitated my shift from caregiver to care receiver. Until that moment, I hadn't realized how much I needed a mother's touch. She listened intently to the short version of Danielle's story. With typical Inupiaq hospitality, she responded with an offer of soup. I deferred. I'm a snob about canned soup. Noticing 2 bags of candy on her dresser, I asked, "Can we sub candy for soup?" "Of course, only a few trick-or-treaters this year." Parched for pleasure, I grabbed fistfuls of Smarties, Sweet Tarts, and Tootsie Rolls. Between my depleted hunger and sex drives and my disappearing dopamine, that chemical of pleasure, my capacity for hedonic happiness had plummeted. "You're more than welcome to spend the night with us. Anytime you want," Marion offered. I'd become part of the family. Thanking her, I donned my snow pants, down jacket, and spotted seal mittens and headed out to the ambulance for the trip back to the clinic. Waiting for sleep that night, I turned over Mike's question about the value of consciousness. He was referring to an introspective intelligence that arises from awareness of one's own feelings and thoughts, a double-edged sword that cuts differently for each of us. Awareness of ourselves had infused our engagement with one another, so we naturally inculcated awareness in Danielle, hoping that she would make fragrant hay with experiences and the people who touched her. We couldn't anticipate that awareness would backfire, leading to torture rather than transformation. We couldn't know that the riches we bestowed on her would intensify her perception that she was special and that her pain was uniquely formidable, or that self-doubt would weaken her fortitude as she faced the prods that worldly engagement exacts, or that her exquisite sensitivity, compounded by sexual assault, would set the stage for debilitating psychic pain. In death, she would seek the peace that comes with mindlessness. If only she were alive to respond to my interpretation of the zombie dream she had posted. What does it mean that I always end up giving up and offering myself to them or killing myself? Zombies, the undead, could eliminate her consciousness, or she could. I believe her dream reflected her life's intolerable reality and a default to suicide when consciousness became too unbearable. Thank you. If you would like to read more of my writing, I'm at rachelfrazin.com and I've begun blogging. Thank you.
Rachel, thank you so much for the written word and all of the reflections. And I'm sure lots of us will be checking out your page. So thank you. That was Rachel Frazin. Our next reader is Lisa Higgs, whose third chapbook, Earthen-Bound, was published in 2019 by Redbird Chapbooks, the same publisher of Unintentional Guide to the Big City in 2015. Her poem, Wild Honey Has the Scent of Freedom, was awarded the second prize in the 2017 Basil Bunting International Poetry Prize from the Newcastle Centre for the Literary Arts in the UK. Her poetry has been published widely, and her reviews and interviews can be found at Kenyon Review Online, the Poetry Foundation, and the Adroit Journal. Lodestar, her first chapbook, was published in 2011. A Minnesota native, Lisa was fortunate to be a participant in the Loft Literary Center Mentor Series in Minneapolis in 2006-07. She received her MFA in creative writing from Hamline University in St. Paul, Minnesota, and teaches 1 or 2 classes a year at the Loft. She currently resides with her family in Rochester. Please join me in welcoming Lisa Higgs.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me just fine. Thank you all for being here tonight. It is a gorgeous night, and to be inside on one of the most beautiful days of Minnesota spring is a testament to your love of literature and poetry. So thank you for being here. Most of the poems I'm going to read tonight are from a full-length manuscript that is currently unpublished, that I'm trying to get published. So I probably won't speak very much about the poems individually unless I feel there's something that you need to know. And this is the poem that opens the manuscript. It's called The Origin. Shut off the sun. No, not dusk in new moon's cusp, but light's eternity snuffed. Sun, stars of this galaxy, distant galaxies shut off. An operative of sense ruptured, a pupil expansive in its dark adaptation. Vision, a limit of what it means to see. Spectrum plotted out to its waves, and even our blinded planet in its little sphere of known constants, with different eyes, could see bundles of creation in full radiant glow. Yes, that moment of spark set down to God's. Let there be in all absences, in all plenitudes, an idea, an origin, one thing from our universe to its edge that grasps starlight as a past. Let there be something reached only through void. And I was going to read a different poem, but then I'm not sure, as everybody else was reading, I was inspired to actually read two poems from my most recent chapbook, Earthen Bound. They were poems I wrote when my grandmother was nearing 100 years old and had a terminal uterine cancer diagnosis. And so I promised her that I would write her a poem a week. And I started doing sonnets, and then she lived for like a year and a half or something instead of the 3 months they gave. So some of the small collection of the better of the sonnets that I wrote to her weekly were collected in Earthen Bound. And so I'll just read the very beginning one and then the closing one. Somehow I feel this year we're kind of dealing with beginnings and endings. So. I sit as you must have sat, to windows, decade of winters that shuttered your steps indoors, when even frail snowflakes settled as ice in potential. One more fall, all too easy off the stoop where you would rest each summer in midday sun, the breezeway full fragrant. And the birds, your sun-filled feeders, bare lilac bowed and sparrows, jays, peaked cardinal, squirrel. At regular times, the dogs on leash, neighbors bundled to run. Your cold doorway opened for meals, medical visits, those quick trips, grocery store, hair salon. How your son drove always the longest way, pointed to ice shacks, eagles' nests, through glass to high flying geese. And the closing poem of my chapbook. You said clearly you would not come swirling in light bands or white shadows breezing corners of airless rooms. But the snowfall is such this morning as clouds thin and wind picks its skin from surface or sky that I want you between broad flakes dancing. As 1 week from our last words, I sat to watch the gulls bodied, raucous on some slip of ice, slighter for frail sunshine, rise and mass, school like silver fish under sea. Each wing a feature of something whole, swimming broad blue, this new being aloft, adhered by air. The few breaking away, flocking westward, white drifts shimmer, then gone. the rest settling again, waiting their turn. So now I'll go back to my initial plan and just read a few more poems from the manuscript that I have. And this one is called Talking to My Daughters About God. And I have a quote from Nietzsche at the beginning. The ring in which you are but a grain will glitter afresh forever. And that's from Nietzsche's notes on the eternal recurrence. Easy to forget when you're 8 and untutored in the rites of the holy. You have no touchstone for the untouched, which makes virgin a word as simple as daguerreotype, for which you also sought definition after some reference heard off public radio earlier in the week. But you're 8, and your sister at 11 has read the body book without the chapter on babies. So I start with Mary because it's a week past Christmas, and you know enough about the star and manger to see speciality in a surrogate birthing a God, unaided from the start by the hands of a man. I can't help mention property, propriety, the real message, a warning. How I lost religion in this vision so delicate, the slightest brush of fingertips could forever tarnish. Or my desire not to be locked behind some enclosure of glass. I never bought a religion's insistence in men at the head, even more now when men as heads seem again eager for the fight. So we try to separate God from the warring faiths, locate the what was before science's spark, and the why create if life means accepting only half an image, even less of the living. We begin to think science and God aren't so different, the natural world as random and unfair as an unconcerned creator. We talk about bilingual Jane, her TV virginity, and Aristotle, Einstein, energy that cannot be destroyed, which you say is as close to God as cinema's force, also wrapped in battlefronts and fictions. I avoid Nietzsche, though we are circling eternal return, because I can't imagine yet a world where humanity means so little to itself. A world floating in some thin space between silver-plated copper and mercury fumes, its image unmoored from its casing, meaning a world all too easy to erase. And the next poem is Wild Honey Has the Scent of Freedom, and it was written after a poem by Anna Akhmatova. Chalk dust plum blossoms sprout in winter sun against pavement as afternoon quivers in ice form. So fluid, green waft of wing song, a bird coat so canine it stands on point. Mark the saturate scent, backyard blood thawed in the glare. Underleaves smell of news, the limp grass of morals. We either care too much or too little. Twigs collected sprout their ashes, damp flame, acrid and hungry. A man's arms across ribs, aroma of midnight. Breath at the neck, the steaming pot before its cup. So love anticipates its fears, rounds its back to press into womb curl. So love floods its lemongrass, its bergamot. So love its teaspoon of wild honey. I somehow picked poems with my husband in them, which aren't that many, and he's not even able to be here tonight, so I feel too bad. He would normally appreciate hearing poems about him. Anyway, the next is meditation. A lake encased in solitary stands of evergreen, wild swatches of silken grass, all golden, even water's stony blue, golden, filtered in late afternoon light. Air coiling cool paths of stalk and stem, swell of current collaring haunch and hock of dog. Water warm, its limbs wrapped in waist-high weeds, reeds and rushes, daisies, cattails scattered. The moon, my apparition, brought to rise in wake of brassy day. Our solitude, sought like tufts of seed aflitter, all downy as sunshine, all falling westward to shadow, silhouette of a man and child, that solid form to secure a heart, man and child abiding. And I think I have two more here. The next poem is Mother, and it's, well, you'll get it. Never mind, I don't have to explain it. Mother. There is a green called waiting. When every spring bud has opened one eye, then held its breath against snow wind, unexpected mid-April. A wheeze that passes quickly, but leaves cloud cold and rain chill into May. A maybe or maybe not of thawed air, temperatures lacking enough sun snug. The season, like an old woman in bed, awake but unready to put her foot against the floorboards until at last the heat clicks on and bare limbs unfurl into a thick robe of leaves. And then my final poem, I go back to my daughters. This is actually not in the manuscript I'm working on, but I quite love this poem, so I thought it was a good end for the other poems I had read. And it's called Our Small Bit of Universe. You know the position of Mars, the precise pastime of the space station, what quick light line meteoring overhead in mere minutes, and moon phase percentages. As you know, Andromeda, untaught by childhood litany, Dipper, Draco, Cepheus, the sisters, her mother, the boastful queen clinging to her upturned autumn throne. You are pointing at the dark north horizon, showing your sister, the little goat, Capella, prismed through our thick atmosphere to blink red-green low in the northeast each October. And I am back atop your old dresser, pressing Cassiopeia out of plastic stars in the corner of your old room, and hanging the 8 planets in quarter orbit out from a styrofoam sun I painted yellow, then glow in the dark, to share with you our small bit of universe. What I love about the world, you have expanded. What you know and love about the world grows, too, beyond property lines and schoolyards into a vast sweep of night sky that is sometimes too dark, yes, and in most aspects unknowable. But everywhere you look, you see pockets full of light, some of which you call to by name. Thank you very much.
Let's all visually Thank Lisa. That was Lisa Higgs. Our next reader is Michael Kiso-Moore, who is the author of the poetry collections What to Pray For and The Song Castle. His work has appeared in many journals such as Poetry City and Waterstone Review, anthologies like Among the Leaves, Queer Male Poets on the Midwestern Experience, as well as the Writer's Almanac. He is the founder of the Birch Bark Books reading series, and he teaches writing and mindfulness classes. When he is not drinking too much coffee, Michael can be found in St. Paul dancing with the Braggart's Morris Dancers. Join me in welcoming Michael Kiso-Moore.
Thank you, Don. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I am really happy to be able to share with you poems from my book, The Song Castle, published by Noden Press. And this came out around January 2020 and had a wonderful book launch. And then I think you can imagine what happened right after that. Not many people have gotten to hear anything from this. So I'm really glad to have a chance to read something from this for you tonight. I should say the book cover was made by my mom. So I have the joy of having book covers made by my mom. So for my first poem, I will read the book that gives the title to the poem to the title of the book, The Song Castle. The Song Castle. I want to build a song sturdy as a castle, with rooms. It must have rooms. A room that can hold Lorca's full moon rising, a room for Whitman's calamus leaves, fecund and green, a room vast enough to hold the rage of Achilles, and another to hold the fall of Troy. And we can give Wilfred Owen that room, for it will be large enough to hold, too, the pity of war. Once we fill all these rooms, can we finally find room enough for love? First, we must find the lost key. Dropped so many times, it is a wonder it has any form at all, or held so fast by some, it can only be removed by the white, nimble fingers of death. Let us then make prodigious rooms for love and hand out the keys prolifically to all who deserve one, and more so to the ones who do not. For is this not a love song like all the songs? And when we finish building this great edifice, it will beat in the deep heart of this cold, cold world, and the song will suffuse every living being, and you will be held, all manner of living beings will be held, and no one will ever be alone again. Thank you. My next poem is called Two Men Holding Hands. Tonight, two men walked on the sidewalk holding hands. It was a summer evening. We were going the same direction for a bit. I watched one man lean down and kiss his boyfriend lightly on the cheek. They smiled, lost in their world of two. Seeing these men hand in hand brought to mind a time I walked thus, holding hands with a boyfriend, a summer day along Lake of the Isles. We were just walking, enjoying being together. A young woman skated by on her rollerblades and screamed, "Faggot." She said more. I think we were going to hell because we held hands. I hate that memory. As I watch these two men, I send them a hope that as they walk this evening hand in hand, the people they encounter smile at them, maybe even give them a high five. No, let me take that back. Not even that. What I wish for them is that nothing happens, that tonight and every time they walk, it is as ordinary as breathing. Thank you. Death comes knocking at my door. When I saw death standing at my doorstep, I thought of the speech I long prepared. Why did you take them away? Why so many? Did you have to take Keith and Bill and Frederick and Malin and Tim and Hunter and Carrie? I could go on with the names all day. Sometimes when I compose this long rehearsed speech, I also ask, why them and not me? All these words hung in the air unspoken as I watched how tired death looked. Death's bones bowed with weariness. So, do you want to come in? I asked. Death gave no answer, but walked in and sat in my living room chair. I dropped over the tired bones, my favorite Afghan quilt knitted by my grandma. I almost said, you are now wrapped by the loved one more you stole, but held my tongue. I made Death a cup of tea, who took it gratefully, and we sat in silence. The strangeness of Death sitting in my living room, covered by my grandma's wool Afghan, sipping tea, wore off. We were not strangers to each other. Then Death stood, handed me the teacup, the Afghan dropping to the chair. As Death crossed my threshold, I said, I suppose I will see you again one day. Thank you. So to say something about this next poem, this COVID pandemic is not my first pandemic. My first pandemic, I lost almost everyone I knew to AIDS. And in my 20s and 30s, I was going to a funeral almost every week, sometimes even more than that. Needless to say, I've done a lot of writing about that, and the subject is not done with me. And for this book, I wrote a new poem. And since our next pandemic, I think it holds some nuance that I don't think I originally had in mind. So see what you think. The year gentleness died. It was the year gentleness died. Larry was first to go, the sweet young man covered with purple lesions. He was the sweetest. Men can be sweet, you know. Then it was Keith's turn. He was a rebel rouser, full of righteous anger. But at his core, he was all gentleness, and it was a plague against the gentle. And then Frederick went, dear lovely Frederick. His spirit was like a puppy's, bouncing and joyful, always joyful, and now gone. I could tell you about Bill and his love of angels because he was one. And if you never met Carrie, I could do this all day, telling you all whom we lost the year gentleness died. They went in the tens, then the hundreds. We lost them by the thousands, then 10 times that across all the lands. They kept falling, all the gentle ones. So this next poem I have for you, it always makes me smile. I have a friend named Karen, and every Christmas, she bakes bread and gives the bread as Christmas presents. It's a wonderful Finnish bread called pulla. And one year, when she gave me one of these wonderful loaves of bread, I wrote an ode about it. So here for you is Ode to Karen's pulla. Sing praise to the grandmothers who, kneading flour, yeast, milk, egg, and butter, pressing the dough with palms, folding it again and again, forming balls all through the years, express their love with every push of hands, filling warm kitchens with smells of yeasty dough. And let us sing praise to the Vikings, yes, Vikings, for on their travels they learned of the jewel of spices, sweet cardamom, grown tenderly in India and escorted to Constantinople, where all roads converged. Did the Vikings know what they brought back would blossom in the cuisine of all Scandinavia? Who first thought it a good idea? One person's whim can shape a culture. Let us sing then to that Viking, woman or man, who first sniffed the spice and said to the merchant, more. Let us praise Karen's forebears and her own mom, who yearly baked the finished bread, keeping alive the splendid traditions reaching down the centuries. And let us take a moment to praise all the ways coffee made its way to the northern lands. More nods to Turkey, for no other beverage tastes better with warm buttered pula. And let us praise Karen herself, who at Yuletide, year after year, needs the gifts of Vikings and grandmothers in her own kitchen, braiding 9 loaves as gifts, filling her hearth with a scent of yeast and cardamom. Another word for pula is love. Thank you. So I would like to share 2 more poems with you. And this poem I wrote a few years ago and was published in the St. Paul Almanac. At the time I wrote this poem, I was thinking of all of our transgender friends who face so much violence, especially our transgender brothers and sisters of color. And since writing and publishing this poem, it's become a bowl that I think holds even much more. So see what you think. It's called The Lost Language. I dream of finding a lost language, a language that has no words for war or any kind of violence a human can make against another. This old, forgotten language will be wise in the use of gender, not binary. This language won't even have the word for binary. And this will be a language that has more words for love than the colors of a large box of crayons, each word a new shade of care, and so vast that dictionaries fill to the brim with every different hue. And all the colors of the human clan will be described by those words of love. For when you speak of your fellow beings with love, how could you ever harm one? If we cannot find this long lost language, then let us make it now. Thank you so much. So for my last poem, it's called A Liberated Space, and it begins with an epigraph. It's from the words of one of my new favorite books that Thomas Smith, who's in the audience here, introduced me to. It's called The Poetry of Surrealism, an anthology. And the epigraph comes from this really wonderful introduction. And the epigraph is, to read a surrealist poem is to survey a territorial tract, however modest in size, of liberated space. Have you seen the liberated space? And yes, that space holds barracudas who swim with can openers and cocoa puffs, along with crazed men pointing guns. But they will be wearing pink tutus and dance in sparkly red high heels, and the stars will sprinkle the cubicles of our jobs with showers of silver glitter. And who wants beige anyway, or the incessant thought patterns that grow ruts and bar you from uncovering your true self? And who cares what anyone thinks anyway, because the moon who sees all our secrets, sings the ballad of Federico Garcia Lorca, and the song sinks deep into the earth where grave-bound bones shed the dusty tears, and the lands tremble, oh, how they tremble, while snow-white horses meet at the lost grave, and poets across the lands take pickaxes and shovels in hand to dig for their wild hearts, revealing with every new word, and even the crossed out ones, the long lost liberated space that will be there and everyone's salvation. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and please join me in visually thanking Michael Kiso Moore. Thank you. Wow, well, a great night. Thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. And we want to again thank Jim and Rachel and Lisa and Michael for leading us all over the world and all through the mind. So thanks. Please join us on June 10th for the next Midstream reading. And I hope everyone gets a chance to walk a poem in the beautiful spring night.